Across snowy Ukraine, life largely continues as normal, as warnings grow of a massive expansion in an 8-year-old conflict.
People are getting on with their daily lives. They're not allowing a dictator and a bully to tell them what to do.
This is the view from our balcony.
Australian Pixie Schmiegel has for weeks been watching and waiting for signs of a Russian invasion. She and her partner Blake have decided it's now time to go, after listening to worried family members back home.
One of our favourite parts.
For us, to be honest, we feel really safe here, and Ukrainians feel really calm about the whole thing, so we hadn't felt the imminent danger.
The pair are concerned about the nation's young people who believe their country's future lies with the European Union in the West and not as a client state of the Kremlin in the East.
Every new restaurant or cafe or business that gets opened up here by the Ukrainian youth is an expression of freedom and opportunity that those that came before them never had the chance to live out.
Ukraine has long been at the centre of a geopolitical tug-of-war. In late 2013, protests erupted in the capital Kiev after the country's president Viktor Yanukovych shelved a free trade deal with Europe in favour of ties with Moscow. 3 months later, he was ousted and fled to Russia. The Kremlin then annexed Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula, and pro-Russian militants took control of part of the Donbass region in the country's east. It's estimated 14,000 people have died in the ongoing war there, but in recent months tensions have escalated even further. About 100,000 crack Russian troops have been deployed along Ukraine's eastern border and in neighbouring Belarus to the north, leading to fears that Vladimir Putin is planning a much more substantial offensive and military occupation to bring the country back under Moscow's control.
If it is not now, then it's going to be too late in 10 years, since younger generation obviously leaning towards European standards of life. There is no glorious Soviet heritage that kind of still present with the older generation.
This is their window.
This is the window of opportunity due to the many factors.
A number of American analysts and former members of the US military claim Putin will never allow Ukraine to fully flourish as a liberal democracy for fear it could encourage similar demands or even a revolution back in Russia. Ben Hodges, the former head of the US Army in Europe, argues the Russian president could move at the end of February, straight after the Winter Olympics end in China.
Unfortunately, I think now it's increasingly likely that he will, in fact, launch a new offensive. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, so they already occupy Crimea and Donbass. And so now what we're talking about is a new offensive.
Hodges would like more European allies to provide weapons to Ukraine, so taking it and holding it will cost the Kremlin far too many lives.
That's what deterrence is all about. It's about getting in the head of the adversary to say, I might fail, or it will be so costly it's not worth doing it. I'm pessimistic. I think he also wants to avoid a fight, but he's using maximum pressure in hopes that the unity of the alliance and our other European partners, that cracks and that we give in to some of the demands so that he can declare victory and we can avoid a conflict.
There do appear to be some differing views on how to respond, particularly in France and Germany.
I think Putin is probably putting pressure on us because he can do it. And he knows that if he splits the European Union.
This month, Germany's Chief of Navy resigned after outraging Ukrainians by declaring Crimea was probably lost to Putin forever.
It is easy to even give him the respect he really demands and probably also deserves.
The Russian president's next move has always been very difficult to predict, but he's been relatively clear about his long-term goals. Putin's called the end of the Cold War a catastrophe and sees it as a humiliation. He's been infuriated by the eastward expansion of NATO, claiming it's a serious threat. Publicly, he's even demanded it be abolished. At a minimum, he believes Russia is a great power alongside the US and China that deserves a clear sphere of interest where it has a major say.
And that sphere of privileged interest is essentially the rest of Europe. He has written recently, quite recently, that he doesn't consider the Ukrainians to be a people and he doesn't consider Ukraine to be a country. And he said that if Ukraine is to be a country, that can only be in partnership with Russia. Who's to define the partnership? Not difficult to guess. So he wants a friendly and compliant government in Kiev.
Kyle Wilson served as a diplomat in Moscow, spent a decade as an intelligence analyst focused on Russia, and has twice translated for President Putin during meetings with Australian politicians.
I'm in the minority that would say my gut feeling is that no, he will not order the invasion of Ukraine. I have two main reasons for that. One, if you think it through, if there is war in Ukraine, many people will be losers. First of all, the Ukrainians. Secondly, the Europeans. Third, probably the Americans. And fourth, the Russians themselves. The winner is going to be China.
For what it's worth, Russia continues to insist it has no plans for a military attack, claiming the speculation is imaginary.
Русофобии как первому шагу к геноциду.
But Kremlin-funded media outlets have been continuing to spread disinformation, like claiming that NATO is preparing to target Russian speakers inside Ukraine. Here in Canberra, it's widely conceded that Russia doesn't really care what we do. If it does invade, the government could put travel bans on Putin-linked cronies and contribute to coordinated Western sanctions. There are also suggestions we might send some gas to Europe if the Kremlin cuts off supply. But our support for Kiev is likely to be largely limited to helping repel cyber attacks. In Ukraine, there are hopes that there'll be no expansion in the conflict and that the Russian troops will return to their barracks. In the interim, though, many are urging the world to pay attention.
I think Australians should really care as well, because there is just such vibrancy in the youth here. There's so much coming out of this country that is really impressive. And to see that stifled would be really sad.
Constanza Sturzenmuller is a Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution and specialises in transatlantic security policy and strategy. Dr. Sturzenmuller, Vladimir Putin's moves are often seen as being about his desire to achieve a sphere of influence. To what extent, though, did the US and Western Europe set the scene for this by expanding NATO eastwards after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I'm going to give you a really short answer for that one. They didn't. I think the threat to Putin is not the presence of NATO farther east than in 1991, but the presence of functioning democratic countries with Slavic cultures. That's what's the challenge here. And of course, that was the challenge of the Belarusian civil society revolution. And that is the challenge of Ukraine. If Ukraine becomes an alternate universe, as it were, of a Slavic political culture with strong cultural and historic ties to Russia, but which decides to be a westward-looking democracy, that begs the question to the citizens of Russia, well, why can't we do that?
This conflict is mainly seen as a US-Russian showdown, but Germany, and for that matter Europe, has a much more immediate interest in what happens.
On the fundamentals, the agreement among Western nations is really quite sound. I think there is a general assessment, including in Berlin, that the demands made there are completely untenable and there can be no negotiations on them. Likewise, there has been agreement that we should talk, but what cannot be in dispute, what cannot be on the table, is the right of European nations to choose their alliances, or the implicit demand from the Kremlin that NATO and thereby America withdraw its presence from Eastern Europe to where it was in 1997 or even earlier. So that we have clarity. We have, where it starts getting complicated and grey and confused is on what means we have to deter what seems to be an extremely determined Kremlin that has talked itself up a very tall flagpole and doesn't quite know how to come down again. The problem here is that there is legitimate agreement, in case there isn't a full-on invasion, of what triggers sanctions, what kind of Russian reaction will trigger sanctions, and how sanctions would then be designed so as to be proportional, which they have to be under international law. If Russia does something slightly more subtle, it becomes more difficult to keep up a united front.
What options does Vladimir Putin have? I mean, does he have any other option than to push forward now in terms of his own prestige at home? What are the options for him to de-escalate this conflict?
I think that Putin may have, and not for the first time, I would add, overplayed his hand. He may have underestimated Western unity when confronted with the list of demands put forth by the Kremlin. I think there's only two things I can see, but I think that they are not on the table right now. One would be some sort of acknowledgement that Ukraine will not be a NATO member for quite a while. That has been suggested by no small numbers of former diplomats and Western think tankers. I personally would find that very difficult to stomach. And the other might be an attempt by Putin to depict the current negotiations, or I think one had better call them conversations, between Paris, Berlin, Kiev, and Moscow in the so-called Normandy format as a diplomatic win whereby the Americans are excluded from the conversation. And Moscow hails Paris and Berlin as the new peacemakers in Europe. I think that Paris and Berlin are not so naive as to fall into this trap. And I think that President Biden would find himself greatly beleaguered in Washington should he be seen to be, as it were, throwing Ukraine under a bus. So I really don't see either of those two things happening in any credible way.
Constanze Stelzenmuller, thank you.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure, as always.
Hi, I'm Lee Sales. Thanks for watching this story. If you'd like to watch more of 730's stories, they are on the left of your screen. And tap on the button below to subscribe and get the latest from ABC News.